with the 28 Conimera, Copimera, and we're after this ceremony, we're gonna go for the moderator and Eduardo Escobar. He's a civil engineer from Católica University of Peru, with a finance from a son and MBA. He's an international consultant in investment projects and private public associations conference member in Peru, Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, and Bolivia. Great experience in the directory, board of directors, construction, concessions, and business consulting infrastructure in Peru and abroad. Today, he is a business manager for COFIDE, engineer, moderator, as well as thank you, Dagoberto Escobal is my last name. I have a couple of comments from Carlos Alarco. Good projects that were with good priorities, planning, to hire specialists, good KPIs, and adequate change management. Nobody thinks about that. Everybody thinks that all the designs are perfect, and when problems appear, then we end up in litigations, a good contract structure, and of course, a good management of supply chain and infrastructure and maintenance. And of course, the PMOs as a good tool for the development of the countries. I think that's fundamental. I supported in Central America infrastructure plans, but I believe that to create investment in countries where investment is difficult, as Carlos mentioned, 1,000, 2,000 million dollars, it's a great impact in development. I wanted to comment a couple of things here before asking Carlos. Checking some of the figures, the Latin America Economic Commissions, about 5 years, they were saying that 100 million the people who don't have access to sanitation in Latin America, 20 million, 25 million that had electrical service, and 25 million who didn't have access to potable water. Maybe this have increased, but it's enormous. But investment is needed 6.2 or 6.2% of the GDP every year to close the gap of infrastructure, and many countries in Latin America are like half, including Peru. So the gap every year is increasing. More or less, in a study, I was reading that investment, $390,000 million were needed per year in sanitation, energy, bandwidth, housing, support for production. 390,000 million, 15 million around Peru, 14 million in Guatemala. So big figures that countries cannot really face. But according to the bank, this lack of investment is basically hauling a lot of people from the neighbor to poverty before pandemic. Let's say 20 million or so. So it's impossible. Why is the investment infrastructure is important and operations of that infrastructure? During the construction phase, we estimate that for any increment of 1% in infrastructure, more or less 0.6 or 1% of increment in the GDP. And during the operation, for every dollar invested in infrastructure, the GDP is $0.20, 20%. The impact is very important, but in addition to that, the private investment in private assets, the one that really help in development, but we need to consider that some of these are volatile investment and the predictability is affected. Countries, when they don't have predictability, the first thing that falls is a private investment in infrastructure. So it's not like that in every country, but there is some proportion. But in Peru, 12 or 16% is the private investment. More or less, in infrastructure, 3%. And it's really sad, and this happens in many countries where I work. But in Peru, invest 6% of GDP. Now we're 3% of GDP, and we have to improve it. Something is happening in the region that the investment in infrastructure are slow, and it's important not only to the growth of the GDP, but GDP is a way of measuring. It generates work, improves the lifestyle, and reduces cost, and generates, as Carlos says, competitive. And that's very important. The paradox here is, in general, we have capacity to do good research. We have good construction companies, local or the ones in the region, or in Latin America, there are many world-class companies that are here. However, we see that there's less of investment, and the big projects are not prioritized, and the bidding systems, awarding systems, are very hard. The time between design and concept and the infrastructure starts operating, it's too long. It's and many projects just are in the shelf. In my opinion, in the majority of the countries, we have a management problem, decision making, leadership, and regulations, legislation in 80% of the countries where I have worked. Before, there was liquidity. The public resources are being committed in this fight for code. And the capacity of countries to get funding has been deteriorated. So if we add the management problem, the reaction capacity is very, very short. With colleagues in the panel, and then I'll introduce them later, perhaps we could identify some proposals or some ideas, or bring some solutions, and that will be the rich part of this panel. And I stopped talking because I'm not the expert here. And a question for Carlos. How do you think, Carlos, that we could motivate our governments to make the decisions for things to happen, to prioritize, to plan, construct, and execute, and to have good infrastructure? Because we see change of ministers, change of government, and or the study was so romantic, and because it's ready and that's pushed to go forward. How do we get our act together for things to happen? What are we lacking? You have seen in many countries these infrastructures. I will tackle two fundamental points. First off, education. When we talk about education, I want to talk about education in project management. If you ask in the government entities, in the ministries, what knowledge do you have about project management in general? I'm not talking about a Ph.D. or something, but the ABC of project management, there's very little people who know about this. Many, and I have seen in different meetings, the topic looks interesting. When I do a similar presentation about today, they look at each other and say, hey, can't we use this for our project that we are talking about this to promote it? And no, we hired the supervisor already. So if we remember the image where we saw the PMO and the wheels, there is a wheel that construction management, from that wheel, from that one tooth is supervision. So what they were saying in that meeting with the ministries and people from the ministry is, for them, to have one tooth of one of those wheels of a complex mechanism was the same as having the mechanism. So they confuse the role of a supervisor with the managed project management. We have to emphasize in education, and we should be committed, everybody here, not they should know it, but give them perhaps some courses, maybe coordinate with a university so that the staff at the ministries understand better this. And the other thing which is important is ask for help. So governments, like for example UK, come to help with their expertise, with their experience, knowledge, goodwill, because sometimes sometimes they don't pay attention to it. They say, "Oh yeah, what he wants is to sign a contract, and he's selling a service, right?" But when a government comes and offers this, or a multilateral that offers this, they pay attention to them, and that presents to the government. If there is an agreement signed with a country to do a X number of years, that program is going to be hardly going to be ignored by the next government. So it's an effort from the group of people that can, maybe they'll pay attention to them, or some friend neighboring governments. How can we help Peru? Here is a possibility. Help them with this kind of transfers in management tools. Okay. I think there are good examples, and the good examples are necessary at the beginning, and commitment from the high level so that the next governments can continue with those examples. So there is a good combination there. So, and to ask a question to Miguel Ropert, he's a civil engineer from Chile University, and maybe more to civil engineers who they like. He has a master's in seismic engineering and a diploma in astronomy. To many of the engineers, to attractive experiences. But in his profile, he's always been involved, and he's been vice president or president of construction associations, Chilean Highway Association, the Court of Discipline, the infrastructure of public commission, in public infrastructure. He's well known in Chile, and he's been participating and driving some of these initiatives, good projects, good management, and that allows me to ask him a general question, which could help for those of us who don't know about this. What do you think, Miguel, are the important topics for good construction, good investment, and good maintenance of infrastructure in projects? How countries are doing it, and how some of these countries are like and few projects and not necessarily the most appropriate ones. In your experience in the association and all your professional career, what do you think are the relevant topics that could add to Carlos Alarco was mentioned? Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation here. This interesting conference and this discussion that we have today in the panel. This topic is so big, we could tackle this in different ways. My experience, more than 40 years in the infrastructure and construction sector in Chile, basically in the private sector, but also been in associations and public sector. In my country, the institutionality has shown to be the most relevant. Along the time, the most important thing is to create some history of management through experience and to institutionalize And I repeat, if I think about an infrastructure project in Chile, the public entity that has a responsibility in this, the Ministry of Public Works, all the necessities of infrastructure um, goes through the experience of this ministry.
Y además está bueno las inversiones privadas, naturalmente, que se han ido desarrollando en nuestro país.
And things that have been developing in the country. What are the main aspects that we should consider as fundamental? How to identify the projects. It's not a minor issue. There has to be some methodologies to identify these necessities. And the recommendations of IDB, for example, as how to set some mechanisms. The health, transportation, infrastructure, airports, everybody has the same need that this system should go forward, identifying the different needs at institutional level and at country level. Once identified these projects, I consider key that at the start, the first analysis is the basic engineering. We have to do an initial assessment to establish a first budget, to start the conversation by identifying the size and the amount of investment. And in parallel, I understand the funding aspect. What is the path for funding for this project? This is the initial steps are necessary for what comes forward. It's important also at this stage to talk about socially assessment in my country. This has been integrated, and it's very important to see the project and see the social component so that this project has a justification not only from the financial standpoint. And then the stage that everybody knows, engineers like, and it's popular, but this is also important. The development of the study, the prior background, the bidding process, study them correctly. As engineers, we always say that a good project at the end has to have a good engineering at the beginning, good study. And many times there are some savings that are not understood, which are relevant when the totality of the investment in engineering. And that's a big mistake that everybody makes in the different countries. We need to do a good initial analysis. Then we have the construction process with the bidding, and then I'm not going to go into detail, but we know that these are well-known processes, systems in place, open and public systems. There's a lot of experience around the world to help to make this happen. During the construction, then there might be some other variations from the financial standpoint, is the control of the technical administration and the contract management. There is something that I would like to highlight. And finally, the final part of the work, which is the maintenance in every project, we should consider and study to consider the way in which this is going to be maintained going forward for the shelf life of the infrastructure. This is a basic model for this topic. And finally, I would like to talk about three more concepts. Something that we always forget is the analysis post-project, the ex-post analysis. We should force all our projects to have an assessment after the project is finished at the execution phase and when the project is running, what happened to and assess the project and do an analysis, a correction analysis for the future. What happened with the management system in the contract for the construction, for the maintenance, what were the relevant aspects that had to be corrected. This stage is imperative, and we are failing, in my experience in Chile, in this stage. Many works are done, and but the mistakes are not being corrected with the experience in the different infrastructure that are running. I think the ex post analysis is fundamental. And finally, two or three final words. In all the stages, we have to talk transparently. Sometimes, if things are not transparent, we run into issues, and I don't want to detail that. Everybody knows what it is. And there has to be a technical independence regarding the technical entities and the political pressure, and the countries have to make an effort to have institutions that work technically and are not subject to some pressures from the political world. Sometimes I always thought that the projects have a life. And since the initial definition of the concepts and the first budget and the first financial analysis and social analysis that need some time. Then there's a stage that engineering studies that need some time. And that time, we shouldn't jump those or skip those steps. And that's a good formula to avoid that political pressure impact or give some instructions to start pieces of work that may not have all the initial stages. If you see the experience in different countries, because of some pressure, political pressure, and maybe just public interest, they start with some initiatives that haven't had a good start. As I mentioned recently, we have to demand that every public investment, and this is also for the private, but in private it's a different story. The public investment to have this initial development, as it's like a baby. When a baby is born, first he walks and then runs. So there has to be some kind of initial analysis. The first part is then social analysis and engineering studies that is necessary so that this project can continue. We shouldn't start a construction infrastructure without having all the initial stages first. And that's a good way, I repeat, to avoid starting something that doesn't have the benefit for the country that is needing at that particular moment in a technical and logical way. Okay, so we could also, I would like to introduce Raquel Machicao. She is civil engineer. She has a postgraduate at the Universidad Autónoma de México, master's in infrastructure, and a Ph.D. Studies in structures. So maybe we have the most academic person here in the group. And I wanted to ask, because in the conversation we had, you mentioned that some projects were the white elephants that sometimes we find. In Peru, I found in Central America also some white elephants, and in other countries. But in Peru, we also have. So how to avoid these white elephants that technical, viable, but also to a positive impact in the society to help reduce the logistic cost and be competitive. I don't know if your experience in Peru and Chile perhaps can help us to give us some examples that because they didn't make sense because no studies were done, as Miguel was mentioning, or because they were just a product of a political pressure or a political offering. How do you consider that we could identify or avoid these big investments that just we have a big debt and less productivity?
el micrófono lo tiene cerrado, Raquel. Ahí está. Ahora sí. Se volvió a cerrar. Ahí está.
¿Ahora sí?
Sí, te escuchamos.
Muchas gracias, Eduardo, por
Okay, thank you, Eduardo, for the presentation and to this invitation of the organizing committee of COPIMEDA to participate in this roundtable. The answering your question, the projects considered white elephants are those projects that have been executed and many times did not have a benefit cost analysis or socioeconomic assessment, projects without a benefit for the society is relevant in the financial finances and resources are allocated, and some priority projects that created a real social benefit. And the projects that have been completed need some resources for its operation and for its maintenance. Projects to be financed with public resources should have a strict process of benefit cost to determine which are the best investments. The bad investments can result in white elephants or projects that spend public money and do not give the benefits that perhaps a better decision could have brought. So the implementation of evaluation process to the kind of benefit cost analysis should be a policy to select those projects that in an efficient way can produce some wealth and value by the population. So it's a moment to rethink the legal framework and administrative for the planning and decision-making in mega projects. The first step, I believe, is to avoid at the start of each, in this case, the governments are 6 years, and novelty infrastructure with high risk. For example, in UK, they have, as Carlos mentioned, the Infrastructure and Project Authority, which is an agency that has to evaluate and do some follow-up in the new construction of public infrastructure. One of the functions is the creation of a list of priority projects prior and with an analysis to a clear methodology. This list defines the action lines in the midterm in infrastructure with free of interest in Mexico. A similar scheme can happen so that an autonomous agency can define objectively what are those priority projects for a long term. Of course, taking care of the social profitability, benefit cost analysis, consider the risk on the overheads and the delays, which are very common. A mechanism of this type can allow to solve some disputes among the priorities of the new administration and the old administration and authority like IPEA, and also for example, the questioned problem we have in Mexico. The hunches, the promise of campaigns, the short-term vision are not the best methods to define the agenda for infrastructure in the country. So adopt good international practices as the UK in infrastructure is an idea to consider. The planning a project in Mexico needs order and a better regulation. So to avoid that mega projects can turn into mega white elephants. And about the examples that you mentioned, I have thousands of them. The dam Paso Ancho in Oaxaca that was going to cost 3,300 million pesos and to benefit water for 22 municipalities since 2014 is there. And at the beginning, the government gave some resources and materials to start the construction. Another example could be the new airport of the city of Mexico, which is emblematic. This cancellation happened in a public consultation process, and because evidence of corruption, this cancellation cost 65 million pesos, and 80% was infrastructure that was already done, and 20% unrecoverable spendings from the contract. Another example, the Estela de Luz. It's a monument built by the bicentennial of the Mexican independence that was inaugurated 15 months after the deadline. And it was invested 1,304,000 pesos, 192% more than the budget. The same thing I can say the Paso Express of the highway El Sol that goes to Acapulco, and this happened recently, 3 months after inauguration. A great hole in the middle of the road, and a vehicle fell and 2 fatalities. There was an overcost of 1,600 million pesos, so 73% of increment. And about the infrastructure of the current government, these are mega projects, not white elephants, but I could say that refinery Dos Bocas had some issues. They wanted to start the operation in 2022, but the last plan of Petróleos Mexico is to operate in 2023. The emissions of CO2 of refinery Dos Bocas, so the 20 years of operation set in the environmental impact manifestation is similar to inhaling 193 million trees. And if a shelf life of 40 million is equivalent of more than 366 million trees. And finally, it's also important to mention the Paso del Tren Maya. This project is 1,500 kilometers that is going to go Chiapas, Tabasco, Campeche, Yucatan, and Quintana Roo. The government of Mexico paid 159 million pesos in consulting, and they say that the construction is a bad idea, but the Mexican government ignored this, specifically for the reserve of the biosphere in Mexico. It's the second more extension of tropical forest in America. Of course, the Amazon is bigger. The research by the tourism ministry, promoters of the National Council of Science and Technology for scientific scientists and consultants. This part of the train is a lot of risk, but the authorities decided to ignore this, censoring and hiding critical information in order to fulfill the political campaign. The government should pay attention more to what the experts are saying. That reminds me of some at the monument to the referee in Peru. I don't know if you know it, or the monument to the moto taxi driver, or the vantage point of Tambopata. The elevator was not working because there's no electricity. You have to do this mechanically. And an important level is the refinery of Tarlara. And that was an important environmental impact, but with those figures we could construct treatment plants for all the different capitals of the country with a good environmental impact. I wanted to ask a question to Carlos Cruz. He is an economist with an MBA in project management. He has had interesting experience as a minister of public infrastructure and general coordinator for concessions in Chile. So those who are in private public associations, we know that this has to do about concessions, and it's the same concept of Peru and different to Central America or Mexico. But there is an association, private public. So some years ago, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico considered the investment to track private investment infrastructure, and many countries are considering this to that investment because there is not a capacity of in-depth capacity to respond in the quality and speed that is needed. And in some countries, this has gone well, in other cases it has stopped. So what was the behavior of the infrastructure in public-private associations in Chile, especially in the last years in Latin America, seen a little bit slow in many countries due to the over-regulation? How do you see this in Chile? Carlos before President Bachelet, and then with Piñera in those periods. how has been the behavior? Not talking about politics, of course, just investment. How do you see this in your experience? Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the presentation of Carlos and for your introduction, Eduardo, and for the comments made by Miguel, Raquel about the main topics. And one of the factors that I consider the motivation for the private investment is the difficulty that countries have to get some funding to have big investment projects. But also there's an option for externalizing management in high complexity, and that's the reason why many projects, mega projects, we adopt to transfer them to private who can take over the responsibility, financial and also construction and operation, so that in such a way that they can fulfill this function of generate progressively conditions to allow a good administration of these projects. In Chile, it has a significant experience. I started this process in the year 95, 26 years ago, and I think we were forecasting. We constructed a framework for more than 10 years, and then it was renewed with minor reviews. And there has been a continuity from the institutional standpoint, and we can see this in a calm way with a lot of expectation in the future. Today we're in a crucial process because all the effort that was done initially to invite private to develop these infrastructure projects are completing their concession deadline. By law, the government should have a new bidding process. The thing is, it goes back to the government and then transfer again to the private sector through bidding processes. So right now there's a discussion about what is the purpose of this process and in what way there's an incentive for the private to keep on this, where there has been a lot of issues in the last year that to some extent the process is kind of slow, but on the other hand, some different conditions as the original concept that the incentives are going to be provided for public and private. The transformation is more of a risk transference to the private, and I would say many times they are not in the capacity of diversifying it, and that has produced some questioning to the project, some unnecessary controversies and modifications in contracts, etc. So there has been a lot of issues there happening as a result of this transfer. What are the reasons for these transfers of responsibility? It has to do with what Miguel was saying, and to some extent, the transfers of responsibility is that the evaluation factor, success factor of the concession is the amount of projects that you bid and not the quality of those bidding or the sequence of the project. And that's a difficult political stimulation, because what promotes these bidding projects at conditions, unnecessary conditions. So what they're doing is having contract relationships that unavoidably will be modified in where the modification is perverse. So in this case, we're in a process, and I believe that it's very complex, and also with a participation, citizen participation, and I think the same thing is happening in the other countries, where the citizens have an important viewpoint in the decision making. So without any alternative. So we have a model that is cracking, a sector from the politics that is questioning the model, a community that is more empowered and with more critical view what's going on, and a private sector that has stopped a lot. So as a consequence of this, is 10 years or so, we created an institution that nowadays I am leading, that is the political council of infrastructure. They're trying to recover the stability, the public policy for infrastructure. It's a private initiative funded by the private sector, understanding that the private sector has more stability than our government, that have a change process that is regular and valuable to the extent that welcome to the alternative, to alternating democracy, but infrastructure projects need continuity to go beyond the government periods and transform them in government projects. So the only way to do this was through the private sector as an institution that can see the continuity of the public infrastructure investment, the long-term vision, to consider the political cross-sectional conditions needed in these projects, and then to look after the maintenance or incorporate all the topics around environment, transparency, and inclusion as central topics. And of course, objectives which are crucial for the country's competitiveness and growth. And the other one that is and then social wellness. I think that, as you were saying, part of the necessities that we have in Latin America should solve in such a way, and the only way to do so is through some policies. So through the experience that we had in infrastructure, and I think it's a good experience in the last 25 years, for good and for bad, and this institution appeared that to recover the sense of planning for it's not really a task as a private we can the government should plan and look at the long term. We should stop the fragmentation of institutions to integrate them in the projects, and the projects should have the permanence to be able to, as Miguel said, give the necessary time for the maturity so that we can have the projects in the way they have to be done and not as an urgency to satisfy political ambitions, and do the corresponding assessment and selection of process with all the ingredients as Miguel was saying. So I think that it's a challenge now, or the Carlos, I think, was mentioned, how do we promote the public, how do we incentivize the political sector to take it, and we incorporated people from the political sector, from the technical component, from the business world, from the academia, in order to, from the private sector, contribute to this change process that is very, very important. Interesting, the initiative that I think there's some destructural movement, but I think we're going on the same path to generate some awareness, because the private sector and many people in the private sector have followed their private aspects, and the governments are still decomposing and breaking some systems. And nowadays, they see what's going on, and then what they say we have to, or they critique. It's easy. It's easy to say when you have to do things, and everybody has to get involved. I think that's an interesting movement. It's not easy to get involved in the private sector, because normally the theory of the free rider operates it. So somebody else do it. Why should I pay the cost? So it's a slow process of incorporating people, and it has been fruitful. And Carlos Alarco, how to plan the future of the infrastructure? And because we were talking in the group the last time, we have to think about infrastructure. There is an infrastructure plan in Peru, in other countries, good. Maybe there's. I was talking some time ago with an ex-director of the Ministry of Chile, that you award some projects, but if you do generate new studies, then you're going to be outside. So here in Peru, with the infrastructure plan, it's good, as you say. How many of those have been executed? And the percentage is little, but but the plan is kind of like frozen. No new projects coming in, and how do we plan this? Not only how to motivate the government, I think we talked about this, but how to plan the infrastructure, thinking that the things are changing. Even the road infrastructure is going to be totally different in 30 years. I don't know how to do this future planning. Do you have an idea? Any comments? Two main comments here. The magic word is decision making. The politician, the authority has to make decisions. Sometimes that hand is shaky, or maybe he gets distracted. There are some other ideas, and that could mean more votes for the future. That definitely it's a reality, and it is there. But there are some other things that is a bit dangerous while you're in that kind of, if I do this or if I do that. And we see now the idea of building a railroad from Apurímac to the coast. They say they just ignored the National Plan of Infrastructure, and now they're prioritizing a project that appeared from one week to the next. But what happens? We lost time. A year is now going by, talking about that train that goes from Apurímac to the coast. And we didn't make any decisions about the projects that were in the plan. So what happens? And this is very perversive because the society is needing more infrastructure. So there's a lot of necessities are piling up. And if we were at the same level of execution, it will be good. We execute and we accumulate, and there is like a flow of projects that are progressing and makes a country develop. But by some decisions that are not made, or for political interest, or because of just decision-making power, just by ignorance, some things are not executed. Tomorrow, the gap is going to be 20% more. Next day, it's going to be 40%. A year, perhaps it's going to be so big that again, we're going to be flooded. So it's a crime, and it's not sanctioned not to execute a project. So, but what is sanctioned is to execute projects in a bad way. This, of course, produces a lot of fear in the officers, not signing, not allowing the project to go forward. Because of the fear, if I sign something, then I don't know what it is. I'm not prepared for this kind of project. I have done roads and sidewalks in my municipality, but I don't know more. So how am I going to sign this if this could create me some litigation? So nobody, if I don't sign, nobody goes to jail for not signing. So we have to help. And that's again the group of professionals, companies with experience, government that want to help us. Maybe it could be the School of Engineering. Any group of competent professionals is available for the public entities that need some decision making and say, we're going to review this technical report. Perhaps you don't really understand. We're going to check it, and then when you're going to see they have the stamps of 5 engineers with 20 or 30 or 40 years of experience in this particular topic, and these engineers have reviewed from top to bottom, they have signed it and they have stamped on it, and that gives you some security to sign it. So I believe that's going to be the biggest challenge, to stop looking and just look to the one side, and this is a big elephant. I'm just going to leave it for the next government to do it. I returned to the public administration after maybe 15 years. It cost me to have the regulations was very difficult for me. The overregulation and the processes and the excessive controls are abundant. and there is an incentive for things to be done well, but at the end, you unincentivize things. Of course, corruption is not going to exist if you don't do anything, but the damage of not doing anything is also. Sometimes there are so many logs to avoid corruption, and we log everything. If you remove all the logs, corruption comes. So what is the midpoint? How many logs should I have? We have to create some mechanisms. Carlos, at some moment we talked about how to create a trust fund for infrastructure to hire PMOs or the best private practices in such a way that there is some fluency and the controls of the government being there, but also it's a different kind of management, more organized, more flexibility, where you can apply the best mechanisms in the private sector that is executing big infrastructure projects or factories or mining companies. And I think that's the value of PMO. And I think there's a question in the panel, how does the PMO add value? Maybe, well, you're the expert, but I think that is this is some kind of insurance? Maybe it's a cost of 2 or 3 or 4%, but it guarantees to some extent that you're not gonna get any surprises on heavy overhead costs, and it's gonna kill your budget. It's going to help you some issues before they happen, and it's going to create some transparency that at the end of the day it's going to be better projects and with a greater social wellness, acceptance by the public, and less subject to questioning. I think that's a great value of PMO for the society. The level of certainty is going to work. I think it's good. I heard the comment of Raquel very briefly. And the question for the person about the value of the PMO, if we can say a project can have the quality we want, and I mean quality of an infrastructure is that the bridge doesn't collapse. It's not the quality of the paint, it's the infrastructure is designed for its use, a transportation system that transport the amount of people that this was promised, and it's a solution for transportation. You can guarantee that that is going to happen, that the deadline is going to happen. No overcost, and if there's an overcost within the rationale, the AACE is the entity that standardizes what is a range of 10-15%, no more plus or minus, compared to the feasibility study, but not what we know, 150% or more. And that doesn't take more than 10% of the deadline was set in the contract. With all these three, we should have the guarantee that that's a path. On top of that, the guarantee integrity. So it's a path that we shouldn't doubt, unless the entities say, if there's a lot of integrity here, then how am I going to do? Because, you know, I had some friends that I was going to work with, and now what's going to happen? So there has to be that kind of dark resistance there. And an interesting question, I had an experience in Uruguay. How can we guarantee the maintenance that the government to have the correct budget for maintenance? From my end, if the infrastructure has a correct size, I think that if the government has maintenance contracts with the private sector and it's committed to follow them and to allocate the budget, it's more efficient than the government, a ministry or a municipality calculating year by year what budget to allocate. Because if you're not going to allocate the 20% of what is needed, then that infrastructure is going to deteriorate in 4 years or 3 years. The case of Uruguay, maybe it's not so precise, but at some point they wanted to promote to have maintenance, road maintenance companies. What was mentioned there, these maintenance companies were ex public officers from the transportation ministry. And when you see the highways in Uruguay, interesting level of maintenance, and the government was doing medium-term contracts for maintenance, and now it's going at a greater level, now provided public-private association, they needed more investment, they needed to be expanded to do structural changes, but that system worked and it guaranteed. In Peru, still there's association private-public by Ministry of Transportation and Communications, which is the infrastructure that is done, and then with 5-year contracts, with compliance of standards, and some criteria, and the government pays. And the government, the serious governments, they have to honor their commitments, and I think that's the correct way of ensuring that the maintenance is happening, because an infrastructure without maintenance, with no planning, no maintenance, then of course it's not going to help in the reduction of the logistic costs. That is also important. Another important aspect, we have 15 minutes, maybe a very short question here. A question for Miguel. From your experience in Chile, as you mentioned, the social component, what is the experience about the opinions related to the environmental impact? Because the big infrastructure projects have something like this. What can you say in your experience in Chilean projects of infrastructure? It's very current. We have more than 15 years with a law and environment working, and this is emphasizing the investment in infrastructure. It's current, and it's also installed in the media communication media. The environmental is being used by the politicians, and today we have some professionals and lawyers in analysis of environmental aspects to do some litigation. So the introduction to the topic is not very positive. There's a lot of people, activists, that have a lot of influence, and I'm talking about investment in infrastructure, but also investment in industry. There's in a country, there is a kind of a bias. Environment synonym of as something as the destruction, and that's very sensitive. So our country, we're living a very complicated situation there. The response to this is transparency, sharing information, our obligation as School of Engineers, the institutions and such, as specialists, all the people should report and inform and look for the communication channels to show that this topic is being, many times it's being conducted badly, and it's affected the development in the sense of sometimes eliminating investments that are necessary for the country. So the investment is important for social development. So here Carlos Cruz was mentioning about what's happening in the investment in construction. Okay, so I hope that his consideration changes and progresses so that the importance of investment is considered. Concession needs attract private investment in Chile that is necessary in any government. and there's no doubt about it. But Carlos is right when there's some issues. Another example, positive example is that institutionality work is investment in the metro. The metro is more than 40 years and started in Chile, transformed into an institution that works, makes investments regularly, including the change of governments, and we have the greatest metro after Mexico, and it's still working, and it has now a public acceptance that it was necessary because the social contribution in Santiago is of a high impact. There is a consensus that all the works are sustainable, and what we should say that it's not possible sustainable development without infrastructure projects. We need water, potable water, highways, ports, hospitals. So the question is not to do or not to do projects. The question is how to do them so that they are feasible and be in a timely fashion. About environment, we have as a fundamental task here, the most important thing is inform the public, transparency in the projects, and of course, try to convince the public opinion that the investments are indispensable for the social and economic development of the country, of course, under the legal standards and frameworks. And we have a project, a big project in Chile. It's an initial delay because 2 or 3 years delay, it's a lot, but I was looking at some information in the USA. They have some delays of 48 or more months of big projects. So we have a law that maybe has some defects, but it works. But the most important thing is that let us work at it. Let's not have litigations, stoppage, problems of some opposers in the social media. That's a big issue that we have to solve with a lot of information and education to the rest of the people. And Carlos Alarco mentioned at the beginning education, in that case, education to the people that are the decision makers and execute projects, but it's important education to the population. It's complicated to say, to explain to somebody that infrastructure project is going to have an impact. Negative, for example, but it's going to have a positive in 8 aspects. So we have to do a balance because anything that we do in the environment, in the nature is going to have an impact. But doing nothing can, it's, of course, society is not going to be, it's going to be able to improve because we need to improve the lifestyle, we need jobs, we need to ensure the water sources. There are many things to do and there's going to be an impact, but the idea is to communicate that the positive aspect is higher than perhaps the negative trade-off. And to do this in a society that still is learning about environment and they're understanding them is a bit complex, and it's a very important task that we have pending in the agenda. So multilaterals, I think they're doing a great effort for the public sector to create capabilities, methodologies to create some awareness, and there are some KPIs for environment that how can you calculate them, and sometimes you don't know. So we need to create some awareness and education on ourselves. Environmental is very important, but because sometimes it could stop an investment without a reason, or it could promote it if things are done right and it's communicated appropriately. So it's a pending task that we have in our country. Something that you mentioned was in England to select projects, this entity that you mentioned, I didn't know. How do you consider this to increase the capacity of the public sector in volume and size and complexity of projects so that we are not thinking that a PMO is adequately, if it adds value, how to ensure the maintenance, to have a technocracy that is a machinery of doing things right and executing them correctly and good projects. How can we do this? If there is more communication in the media, exposure, more zeal, lack of trust, how this turmoil in Latin America, how can we make it possible to attract the best talent, retain it, and protect them if it's necessary for this overexposure? Do you have an idea in your experience in Peru, Mexico, how to have good technocrats? It's a complicated question because it's very hard to achieve that everything works perfectly at every stage. So to have a good start, as Miguel was mentioning, is very important so that we can have a good team of professionals to develop good projects, and these projects are reviewed so that the outcome is going to be great, it's going to be well executed, following all the standards, so that could be executed, run it, close the project, and finally have a good operation and maintenance throughout the shelf life. I'm trying to remember an example of something that failed here, which is important. Some years it was inaugurated with rings and bells, line number 12 of the metro, the Golden Line, in which last year part in the surface collapsed. So and that's very important to take care of all the details of all the stages in order to carry some projects that are not only good from the start, but also good in the operation and maintenance or in the future operation. Carlos, you had some public experience and some exposure. How do you think that we can, how can we improve the institutionality and the quality of the technocrats or bureaucrats in the good sense? I am a bureaucrat to some extent in the government. I have a different, it's not technocracy. I think the problem that we're facing in every country is a political problem, and the political item is if we assume that the infrastructure, the mega projects are projects of the state and have an implication in the productivity of the growth, but it has an implication for the community to be in charge of the environmental aspects, the education, to assume that transparency is a condition. And what we're talking about here about politics, not technical. So in that case, is to do the same reflection, but from the point of view of the politics. I'm talking about small politics. I'm not talking about contingency. I'm talking about political state, the long-term view, development, necessity of having a new pact as how to face these big projects. And in that sense, the challenge is enormous because we have wasted a lot of time when we talk about the experience of UK or the Australia or the experience of New Zealand, which are countries that have their own, to have their own continuity. It's because they have an agreement. So what has Australia do? It's an advisor of the Prime Minister. They need to do, they have a high evaluation, high political recognition. For the minister is difficult not to accept those. So we have to install that. The multilateral have played an important role in revealing the problems, but very concrete proposals on how to tackle them. All the countries have lack an entity for long-term planning. In every country, we have the same fragmentation of institutions that has to do with the political dynamics. So if the business of a president So we start incorporating ministers, and that's been the practice where the vision of long-term was lost. We have an obligation to recover and not being technocrat. If you don't have a long-term view, you're not going to. It happens in personal and in private world. I think we have to change the mindset. We have to. We don't change infrastructure plans just because it makes sense. This is you are predicting a bad future. The policies of long term should be of the state and not from the government who is in office. Eduardo? Before the time is over, I just wanted to have an idea. Since this is organized by the School of Engineers in Peru, but as what Miguel was mentioning, there are some groups that are opposed to the project, and normally they're the young people that are from universities. Maybe an effort that we can do and join with the School of Engineers of Peru to go to the different universities in the different regions and explain to them what's a business case, what's an infrastructure, what are the risks of a private company when they do a project, all of these things that the students don't receive this in the university when they study engineering or any other career, and then do some kind of a positive teaching in the students at the different universities. So when they are called to go to throw rocks and protest, that doesn't really make sense because this is damaging my society. And maybe the School of Engineers could promote some talks at universities, and we are available to help you with that issue. I don't know if Miguel, Ropert, do you have a final conclusion to give you an additional view to what Carlos was meant, the two Carlos mentioned? Carlos, the speaker, I agree with him. Education and information. I believe that the idea of Carlos is very good. If we can go to the universities to inform what's an investment, what is from the social aspect, from the wellness aspect, how we get out of poverty, how we reduce poverty. So these are topics that we can go and to some extent evangelize. I think that's a path. Lots of information, transparency, follow the standards, follow the norms, and education. I agree with you there. And Raquel, a final message, a closing phrase. How do you see the topic in infrastructure logistics?
Raquel, estás en mute.
Ahí está, perfecto.
Definitivamente cuidar el inicio.
To be very careful with the start of the project, do a benefit cost analysis. I emphasize this because it's the basis for ensuring a good solution at the end. Thank you. Good projects, good management, and long-term plans, and education, and so that the people can defend and protect and be aligned to the long-term policies of the country. I thank you very much for your participation today. Those of us that have been more years, I guess Miguel is the youngest one, but at the end, there's a richness of having some experience in two locations and two countries that are very rich, very complex, and very similar at the same time. Dagoberto, or Julio. Dagoberto, he does a closing, and then he's gonna ask the panel members and to the panel and the presenter to stay for the official photo. To the five of you, Dagoberto, could you take the mic and conclude this session? We would like to thank the speaker, Carlos Alarco Proño, and the moderator, engineer Escobal, Eduardo Escobal, and the panel members. We are in the 28th International Congress Copy Meta, and we thank you very much. And we took note of these aspects, and this has been recorded, and this recording would be given to the School of Engineers in the National and also the Department Council of Lima. This good initiative, we congratulate you and thank you very much, everybody, for the photo. Your best smile.
Ok,
Una más.
una más.
Sin anteojos, una más sin
Sí, sí,
anteojos.
sí.
Cuando diga 3, digan whisky. 1, 2, 3, whisky.
Chicha.
Muy bien.
Dice Wiki, ya estamos viernes, ojo. Muchas gracias, muchas gracias. Bendiciones, fin de semana, bendiciones.
Gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Be healthy.
Dios los bendiga a todos.
Gracias, igualmente, gracias.
Ya, Carlos, ¿estás ahí conectado? Will, ¿me escuchas?
Dígame.
Will, ¿me escuchas? Un favor, ¿le puedes dar paso al ingeniero Cárdenas para que despida el día e invite para mañana?
Que así no yo. ¿Perdón?
¿Le puedes dar el paso al ingeniero para que despida el día de hoy y mañana e invite para mañana, por favor?
Ya, ok, pues ya habíamos cerrado, ya, no estaba en el guión.
Pero un ratito para invitar, porque mañana hay otras conferencias.
Ya, ¿dónde está el señor Cárdenas?
Aquí está. Aquí está.
Ya, acá estamos. ¿Puedes mandar a Cárdenas? El señor Darwin, es el que va a salir.
Sí.
Ya, un ratito, por favor, que no estaba mapeado. Y cuando es así, nos cuesta un ratito cuadrar todo. Darwin, sí. Sí. Ya, vamos a la cuenta de 3, 2, 1.
Amigos, buenas noches. Colegas todos, buenas noches. Gracias por acompañarnos en este segundo día del Congreso Internacional Copimera Perú 2021. Hemos tenido una jornada muy intensa el día de hoy. 4 conferencias magistrales, ponencias, visitas turísticas, una jornada en la cual hemos seguido nutriéndonos de todos los conocimientos, aumentando nuestros conocimientos en las últimas técnicas y tecnología en lo que respecta a ingeniería mecánica, eléctrica y electrónica. Se han tocado temas muy importantes relacionados inclusive a la robótica, a cómo hacer cultivos con robots en zonas altoandinas, aprovechando todos los terrenos y haciendo una similitud a los incas. Para mañana les invitamos que tenemos el último día de conferencias magistrales, ponencias, y a las 7 de la noche el programa de clausura, en la cual estarán presentes nuestro decano nacional, el decano del Consejo Departamental de Lima un resumen de todas las actividades realizadas y estará dando por clausurado este evento internacional el ministro de Energía y Minas en representación del presidente de la República. Dicho esto, les agradecemos por su presencia y les esperamos el día de mañana a todos ustedes a partir de las 8 de la mañana. Muchas gracias y buenas noches.